The city breathed with a lazy, Saturday morning rhythm. Sunlight, the kind that felt like melted gold, dripped down between the tall buildings and pooled on the cobblestones of the farmer's market. For Cassandra, everyone called her Cassie, this was her weekly slice of peace. The air was a delicious mix of baking bread, ripe strawberries, and the sweet scent from a bucket of fresh-cut flowers she was considering buying for her apartment. It was a new apartment in a new part of town, a symbol of her new life, a life she was building piece by careful piece, away from the shadows of her past. She hummed softly to herself, running her fingers over the velvety petal of a sunflower, her basket already heavy with a warm loaf of sourdough and a jar of local honey. This simple happiness was still a fragile thing, a delicate soap bubble she carried with her. Could pop so easily. And then it did. Her eyes, scanning the crowd for the cheese vendor, snagged on a familiar, horrible silhouette. Mark. Her ex-husband. He was standing by a stall selling leather goods, his back to her, but she would know that posture, that particular way he held his head, anywhere. A cold wave washed over her, so intense it felt like her feet had frozen to the cobblestones. Her breath hitched in her throat, a tiny, trapped sound. The cheerful noise of the market, the laughter of children, the bartering of customers, muffled into a dull, roaring rush in her ears. Her first instinct was to run. But where? The market was a maze of stalls, and if he turned around he would see her for sure. She could duck behind the flower stand, but that felt too exposed. Her heart was a frantic, wild bird beating against her ribs. She needed a shield. She needed to disappear. Her gaze, desperate and darting, swept across the crowd and landed on a man. He was tall, much taller than the people around him, and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested strength, not just from a gym but from a life that demanded it. He was dressed simply in dark trousers and a gray sweater, but there was an air about him, a stillness that was intense and out of place in the bustling market. He wasn't shopping. He was just observing. It was a crazy, reckless idea. But panic is a powerful fuel for crazy, reckless actions. Before her sensible mind could catch up, her feet were moving. She weaved through a group of tourists, her basket bumping against her leg, her focus narrowed to that one man. She didn't think about who he was or what he might do. He was just an anchor in her storm of fear. She reached him, her hand shooting out before she could lose her nerve. Her fingers, small and cold, slid between his larger, surprisingly warm ones, lacing them together tightly. He went perfectly still. Not the stillness of before, but the frozen, dangerous stillness of a predator surprised. Cassie looked up, her eyes wide and pleading, the color of a summer sky but clouded with pure terror. She saw the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar above his brow, and the dark, intense eyes that now looked down at her, first with shock, then with a flicker of something she couldn't name. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "just for a minute, pretend you know me." She gave a tiny, desperate gesture with her head towards where Mark was now turning, his gaze starting to sweep the crowd. The man, Silas, felt the world shrink to this single, bizarre moment. He had been mentally tracking the movements of a potential rival's messenger, his bodyguards, Marco and Ben, positioned like statues 20 feet away. He saw their hands twitch, ready to move. His own instincts screamed at him to shake off the contact, to neutralize the unknown variable. But then he felt it, the violent tremor in her hand. He saw the absolute, unacted fear in her eyes. This was no setup. This was a real, raw human panic. The command to his men died in his throat, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar urge to shield this stranger. His large hand, which had broken bones and ended lives, closed gently around hers, his thumb giving a soft, reassuring stroke over her knuckles. "It's okay," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, a sound that seemed to cut through the noise and anchor her. He shifted his body slightly, using his broad frame to block her from view, creating a small, private sanctuary for her in the middle of the crowd. They stood like that, hand in hand, for what felt like an eternity to Cassie. She could feel the solid strength of his arm, the steady, calm pulse of his presence. She kept her face turned into his shoulder, breathing in the clean, masculine scent of his sweater, trying to make her own breathing match his calm rhythm. She watched from the corner of her eye as Mark, looking annoyed and frustrated, scanned the market one last time before shoving his hands in his pockets and walking away, disappearing into the flow of people. A long, shaky sigh escaped her lips. The immediate danger was gone. The tension drained from her body, leaving her feeling weak and suddenly, deeply embarrassed. She slowly, reluctantly, untangled her fingers from his. The space where his hand had been felt strangely cold. I am so sorry," she stammered, her cheeks flushing a bright, warm pink. That was Completely insane of me. He was my husband. My ex-husband. And I panicked. She couldn't quite meet his eyes, focusing instead on the basket handle she was now gripping tightly. Thank you. Thank you so much. The silence that settled between them after Cassie's stammered apology was thick and heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the lingering ghost of her fear and the solid, unasked-for protection he had offered. The market's cheerful noises, which had vanished for Cassie during her panic, now rushed back in a wave of overwhelming sound: the clatter of a coffee cup, a baby's giggle, the distant ring of a bicycle bell. It all felt too bright, too loud, too much. She took a small, shaky step back, creating a physical space between them that somehow made the whole strange event feel more real and more mortifying. Silas watched her. His dark eyes, which usually assessed threats and calculated advantages, now took in the delicate flutter of a pulse at the base of her throat, the way her fingers nervously twisted the handle of her now crooked wicker basket. He saw the faint sheen of perspiration on her temple from her earlier fright. She was a storm of delicate human vulnerability, and he, a man who dealt in absolutes and consequences, found himself utterly captivated. The part of his mind that was always on duty, the part that was Silas the boss, whispered that this was a complication, an unknown variable introduced into his carefully controlled world. But a deeper, quieter part, a part he rarely acknowledged, was intrigued. Her honesty was a foreign currency, and it was disarming. "Let me walk you to your car." The words came out of his mouth before the strategic part of his brain could veto them. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered in that same low, calm rumble that had steadied her just moments before. It held no room for argument, yet it wasn't a command. It was an offer of continued shelter, and Cassie, whose nerves were still feeling as frayed as old rope, grasped at it. You really don't have to," she managed, finally looking up to meet his gaze properly. His eyes were a deep, rich brown, like dark honey, and they held an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "I know," he said simply, and then he did something that shocked both of them. He reached out and gently took the heavy basket from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and another little jolt, entirely different from the fear, went through her. He fell into step beside her, his presence a silent, imposing shield as they began to weave through the thinning crowd. The walk was quiet, but not silent. He asked a simple question, his voice neutral. Was he always like that? He didn't need to specify who he was. Cassie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was easier to talk while walking, not having to maintain eye contact. Yes. No. Not at first. It was the control, you know? Where I could go, who I could talk to. It started small, so small I didn't even see it. Then it got bigger. Louder. She surprised herself with her own candor. She never talked about this, especially not with a stranger. But there was something about his quiet, attentive silence that invited confession. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. Now seeing him, it just brings it all back. Silas listened. He was an expert listener, often hearing the things people didn't say. He heard the strength it had taken for her to leave, the resilience it took to be here now, buying bread and flowers at a market. He heard the echo of a fear that was still too fresh. It was a world away from the problems he solved, problems that usually ended with a final, violent period, not this messy, emotional ellipsis. "You were brave," he said, and the words coming from him sounded like a simple, undeniable fact. "To leave. And what you just did. That was smart." They reached her car, a small, slightly dented compact that looked terribly ordinary parked on the elegant street. The bubble of their strange shared moment was about to pop. Reality was waiting. Cassie fumbled in her pocket for her keys, the jangling sound unnaturally loud. She turned to him, taking her basket back from his outstretched hand. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling inadequate. "For everything. I'm Cassie, by the way. Cassandra, but everyone calls me Cassie." "Silas," he replied. "Just Silas. No last name. No title. Just a name offered like a secret." There was another pause, a crossroads hanging in the air between them. He could nod, turn, and walk away. This would become a bizarre story she would maybe tell a friend someday. A strange, handsome man who helped her in a market. But he found he didn't want to walk away. The thought of this bright, fragile connection snapping felt wrong. The strategist in his mind was now fully alert, listing the countless reasons this was a catastrophic idea. But the man, the one who had felt the tremor in her hand, overruled him. "Cassie," he said, testing the sound of her name. "I would like to know that you got home safely. That the rest of your day is calm." He was choosing his words with a care he usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. "Would you allow me to have your number?" Cassie's heart, which had just settled back into a normal rhythm, did a little skip. This was insane. He was a complete stranger, a man she had accosted in a market. A man with an intensity that hinted at a life she couldn't begin to imagine. But the memory of his hand in hers, the steady calm he had provided, warred with all the sensible warnings. The part of her that was building a new, brave life won. "Okay," she said, a small, surprised smile touching her lips for the first time since she'd seen Mark. "Yes. Okay." She recited the number and he memorized it, repeating it back to her perfectly without pulling out a phone. That small detail felt oddly intimate and a little old-fashioned. With a final nod, he turned and walked away, melting back into the city's flow as if he had never been there. Cassie got into her car, her hands still unsteady on the wheel. She sat there for a long time, the scent of the sunflower from her basket filling the small space. The fear of Mark was gone, replaced by a buzzing, nervous anticipation. Her phone, sitting silently in the passenger seat, suddenly felt like the most important object in the world. The day had taken a turn she never could have predicted, and her new life suddenly felt a lot less predictable and a lot more interesting. The evening after the market, Cassie's apartment felt different. The quiet, which usually felt like a comforting blanket after the noise of her old life, now felt heavy and expectant. She had put the sunflower in a vase on her small kitchen table, its bright, bold face a constant reminder of the morning's strange turn of events. She went through the motions of putting away her market finds, the jar of honey clinking too loudly against the shelf, the bread seeming to take up too much space on the counter. Every few minutes, her eyes would dart to her phone, a silent, dark rectangle on the couch. Had it all been a fluke? Had she imagined the entire intense encounter? Perhaps he had just been humoring a frantic woman and had already forgotten her number. Then, just as she was convincing herself of this, the phone lit up. Not with a call but with a simple text message. The screen showed only a number, not a saved name. "This is Silas. Did you make it home?" The simplicity of it, the directness, sent a fresh wave of that strange, buzzing anticipation through her. She typed back, her fingers clumsy. "Yes, safely. Thank you again." A moment later, a reply. "Good." And that was it. But it wasn't the end. It became a pattern. He would text her later that night, a single question. "Was your day calm?" She found herself telling him about the book she was reading, how she'd burned the dinner she was trying to cook. He, in turn, was a man of few words, but they were always focused entirely on her. He asked about her job at the small design firm. He remembered she mentioned wanting to try a new recipe. He never offered anything about his own day, deflecting with a simple, "It was busy. Tell me more about your book." A week after the market, he asked her to dinner. Not to a loud, flashy restaurant, but to a small, quiet Italian place tucked away on a side street, the kind of place you had to know existed to find it. Cassie spent an hour agonizing over what to wear, a nervous flutter in her stomach that was entirely separate from the fear she'd felt with Mark. This was the thrill of the unknown. When he picked her up, he was exactly as she remembered, impossibly tall, dressed in a simple dark button-down shirt that did little to conceal the power in his shoulders, his gaze intense and focused solely on her. The dinner was easy, surprisingly easy. He listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face, making her feel like she was the only person in the world. He asked questions, drawing her out, making her laugh about a mishap with a client's logo design. He was charming in a quiet, understated way, and the intensity she felt from him was now channeled into a disconcerting level of attention. He began to weave himself into the fabric of her new life. Their dates were never typical. They didn't go to crowded movies or noisy bars. One evening, he drove her out of the city to a hill that overlooked the twinkling grid of lights below. They sat on a blanket in the cool night air, not talking much, just watching the city breathe. Another time, he took her to a private, after-hours viewing at a small art museum, the empty halls echoing with their footsteps, the paintings seeming to exist only for them. It was on this date, standing before a stormy seascape, that he first kissed her. It wasn't a rushed or demanding kiss. It was slow and questioning, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw with a terrifying gentleness. It was a kiss that held back a universe of force, a promise of passion carefully restrained, and it left her breathless and aching for more. In these carefully curated moments, Cassie felt herself falling. She was building a life with him in these pockets of peace. She told him her dream, the one she barely admitted to herself, to quit her job and open a little flower shop, a place filled with light and life and color. He didn't laugh or dismiss it. He looked at her with those serious eyes and said, "You should. You have an eye for beautiful things." He made her feel seen not as a victim or a project, but as a person with dreams and a future. But his world, the world of Silas the businessman, began to press in at the edges of their bubble. She started to notice things, small cracks in the perfect facade. The way the other patrons in the quiet restaurant they frequented never sat at the table next to theirs. The way a large, unsmiling man, the same one from the market, she realized with a start, seemed to be sitting in a car across the street from her apartment building some nights. She mentioned it to Silas once, lightly, and he simply said, "It's a safe neighborhood. Probably just a neighbor." But the answer felt too smooth, too practiced. Then there were the phone calls. He never took them in front of her. His phone would vibrate with a specific, insistent pattern, and his face would become a mask, the warmth draining away to be replaced by a cold, impenetrable stillness. He would excuse himself with a quiet, "I have to take this," and walk away, his voice dropping into low, terse syllables she could never quite make out. He would return minutes, sometimes an hour later, the shadow of whatever that call was about lingering in his eyes before he could force it away and smile at her again. The lies were always small, always reasonable. "A difficult client," he would say. "A business deal that's hitting some snags." But the pieces weren't fitting together. The man who held her hand so gently under the stars was also a man who carried a constant, hidden tension in his shoulders, a man whose business required a level of secrecy that felt heavy. The paradise he was building for them felt more and more like an island, and she was starting to wonder what kind of ocean, filled with what kind of monsters, surrounded it. The fear she had left behind with Mark was being slowly replaced by a new, more confusing kind of dread. The fear that the man she was falling in love with was a beautiful, dangerous stranger. The unease that had been a quiet, whispering thread in the tapestry of their relationship suddenly snapped, pulling everything taut and frayed. It happened on a Tuesday. Cassie had stayed late at the design firm, finishing a project presentation. The city at night was different from the city she walked with Silas. The quiet streets felt emptier, the shadows between the pools of lamplight deeper and more pronounced. She said goodnight to the security guard and stepped out into the cool evening air, pulling her coat tighter, her mind already on the leftover pasta waiting for her at home and the prospect of a video call with Silas, who was away on one of his vague business trips. She had only taken a few steps towards the parking garage when a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, a car that screamed of money and menace, pulled smoothly to the curb beside her, blocking her path. The doors opened almost silently, and two men in impeccably tailored suits emerged. They didn't look like thugs, they looked like polished executives, but their eyes were flat and cold, and they moved with a coordinated purpose that froze the blood in her veins. "Ms. Reed," one of them said, his voice polite but utterly devoid of warmth. "You'll need to come with us. Mr. Valerius would like a word." Cassie's heart plummeted into her stomach. Valerius. She had heard that name once, whispered in a tense phone call Silas had thought she was too asleep to overhear. It was the name of a rival. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror, colder and sharper than anything she had felt with Mark, washed over her. This was different. This was a danger she couldn't reason with, couldn't plead with. She took a stumbling step back, her keys slipping from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the pavement. Before the man could take another step, the night erupted. Another car, this one a dark SUV, screeched to a halt behind the sedan, its doors flying open. Marco and Ben, Silas's ever-present shadows, moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation. It was a brutal, silent ballet of violence. The sounds were sickeningly soft, the thud of a fist hitting flesh, a grunt of pain, the crack of bone. In less than 30 seconds, the two well-dressed men were on the ground, unconscious or worse, and Marco was calmly ushering a trembling, shell-shocked Cassie into the back of the SUV. Ben was already on the phone, his voice low and steady. "It's handled. We have her. The package is secure." The ride was a blur. Cassie sat in the plush leather seat, shaking uncontrollably, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. They didn't go to her apartment. The SUV navigated a series of turns, moving into a part of the city she had never seen, where the houses were not houses but vast, gated estates shrouded by trees and high walls. They swept through a gate that opened soundlessly and pulled up in front of a modern, minimalist mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. Marco opened her door and guided her inside, his touch firm but not unkind. The interior was breathtakingly beautiful and starkly empty. Polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a dark, manicured garden, and almost no personal touches. It was the home of a ghost. Silas was there, waiting in the vast, open-plan living room. He had clearly just arrived himself, his coat discarded over a chair. The moment he saw her, his face, which was usually a carefully controlled mask, shattered. Raw, unchecked fear and a blazing, terrifying anger warred in his eyes. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Cassie," he breathed into her hair, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "God, Cassie. Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" She shook her head against his chest, the tears finally coming, hot and silent. He held her for a long time, until her shaking subsided into hiccuping shudders. Then he led her to a large sofa, sitting her down, his hands gripping hers. The moment of tenderness was over. The mask was back, but now it was cracked, showing the terrible truth beneath. "Cassie," he began, his voice low and grave. "You are no longer safe. Because of me. Because of what I am." He took a deep breath, the weight of his entire world seeming to press down on his shoulders. "I am not just a businessman. The world I operate in, it has rules, but they are not the rules you know. I am the head of an organization. Some would call it a family. Others call it the Mafia." The word hung in the spacious, sterile air between them, ugly and final. It was a word from movies, from crime dramas, not from her life. Not from the man who had kissed her so gently in an art gallery. She stared at him, her mind refusing to process it. The strange neighbors. The bodyguards. The secretive phone calls. The private museum viewings and the hilltop vistas that felt like rented privacy. It all clicked into a horrifying, perfect picture. "The man who sent those men tonight, Valerius, is a rival," Silas continued, his eyes begging her to understand. "He wanted to get to me through you. I have been trying to transition my business, to make it more legitimate. For you. So I could have a life with you without this shadow hanging over us. But these things take time and I was too slow. I put you in danger. I am so sorry." The apology broke the spell of her shock. The fear melted, replaced by a white-hot surge of betrayal. She pulled her hands from his as if his touch had burned her. "You're sorry?" Her voice was a whisper, then it rose, sharp with pain. "All this time, Silas? All those dinners, those talks about my future, my dreams? And you were lying to me. Every single day was a lie. You let me fall in love with a man who doesn't exist." She stood up, pacing away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. "A mafia boss? What does that even mean? Do you hurt people? Do you kill people?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her, his silence more damning than any confession. The man she loved, the man she had trusted with her fragile, reborn heart, was a stranger. A dangerous, powerful, criminal stranger. The beautiful, peaceful world he had built for her was a gilded cage, and the lock had just been shown to her. The love she felt for him was now tangled with revulsion and a deep, soul-crushing sense of foolishness. "I can't do this," she choked out, tears streaming down her face freely now. "I left one prison, Silas. I won't walk into another one, no matter how beautiful you make it look." She walked towards the door, her legs feeling like water. He didn't try to stop her. He just watched her go, his face a monument of stone and sorrow. Marco, who had been standing silently in the foyer, looked at Silas for instruction. Silas gave a single sharp shake of his head. Cassie pushed the heavy front door open and stumbled out into the cold night, leaving the fortress and the man she thought she knew behind. The gilded cage was open, but the freedom she had fought so hard for had never tasted so much like ashes. The days that followed her flight from Silas's mansion bled into one another, a gray, monotonous stream of forced normalcy. Cassie went to work. She answered emails. She tried to eat. But her new life, the one she had been so proud of building, felt like a cheaply painted set. The colors were all wrong, the props flimsy. The memory of Silas's world, a world of terrifying truth and brutal elegance, made her own existence seem pale and insubstantial. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach every time she remembered the men in suits, the silent violence in the street. But it was no longer the dominant feeling. It had been eclipsed by a profound, aching emptiness. She missed him. It was a simple, devastating truth that settled deep in her bones. She missed the sound of his voice, a calm rumble in a chaotic world. She missed the way he looked at her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in his entire shadowy empire. She missed the feeling of his hand, large and warm and sure, enveloping hers. She tried to summon the anger, the righteous betrayal, and for a time it had worked. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, with only the cheerful, oblivious sunflower as a witness, The anger felt thin and worn out. He had lied. But he had also protected. He was a mafia boss. But he was also the man who remembered she loved the smell of rain on concrete and who had driven her to the hills just to watch a storm roll in. Meanwhile, in the stark silence of his own home, Silas was unraveling. The business, the empire he had spent his life building, felt like a hollow, poisonous thing. The confrontation with Valerius's men had been the final, brutal proof that his old life and his love for Cassie could not coexist. He saw the shattered look in her eyes, the revulsion and the pain, every time he closed his own. He had spent a lifetime being feared, respected, and obeyed. But he had never, until now, felt the true cost of that life. It was the cost of losing her. Marco and Ben watched him, exchanging concerned glances as he dismissed a lucrative deal with a wave of his hand, his attention elsewhere, his focus gone. He was a king in a castle of his own making, and he had never felt more like a prisoner. He knew he could force the issue. He could have men watch her apartment, report on her every move. He could engineer another chance meeting. He had the power to weave himself back into the fabric of her life, whether she wanted it or not. But the thought of her fear, of her feeling trapped, was worse than the thought of losing her forever. If he truly loved her, he had to love her enough to let her go. But before he could do that, he had to tie up the loose ends. He had to make her world safe even if he couldn't be in it. He used his considerable resources not for profit or power, but for a quiet, precise campaign. He gathered evidence of Mark's past financial manipulations and anonymous threats, delivering it all to a high-priced lawyer with a single instruction. Ensure Mark signs these divorce addendums and this restraining order, and understands that any contact with Cassandra Reed will result in his entire life being dismantled. It was done within 48 hours, a final, silent gift. A week after she had walked out, Cassie found the official-looking envelope in her mailbox. Inside were documents from a lawyer she'd never hired, stating that Mark had agreed to all her terms and a permanent restraining order was in place. There was no return address, no note. But she knew. It was his handwriting on the world, a language of power and protection she was beginning to understand. And in that moment, the last of her anger dissolved. He wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to free her. He was clearing the path for her, even if he wouldn't be walking it beside her. That realization gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. She didn't call. She didn't text. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the city in hues of orange and purple, she simply got on a bus, then another, and walked the final few blocks to his neighborhood. The gates to his estate were just as imposing as she remembered. She stood before them, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The final choice. She could turn around, go back to her safe, gray, manageable life. Or she could step forward into the beautiful, dangerous unknown. She pressed the intercom button. There was a long silence, then a familiar, cautious voice. Yes. It was Marco. It's Cassie, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. The gate buzzed and began to swing open without another word. He had been waiting. He had left the door unlocked for her. She walked up the long, winding driveway, her footsteps echoing in the twilight. He was standing on the steps of the mansion, not inside. He was wearing a simple black sweater and jeans, and he looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than she remembered. He didn't move, just watched her approach, his eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. She stopped a few feet from him, the cool evening air between them. I got the papers, she said softly. He nodded slowly. I wanted you to be free. Truly free. From all of it. I know, Cassie replied, her voice growing stronger. And I've been thinking. My whole life I've been running from things. From Mark, from fear, from my past. I was so busy running away, I never stopped to think about what I was running towards. She took a step closer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You lied to me. Your world is dark and it's scary. But Silas, the man who held my hand in a market, the man who listens when I talk about flowers, the man who protected me even when I didn't know I needed it, that man is real. And I love that man. Not the mafia boss. The man. She took the final step, closing the distance between them. I'm not asking you to change your world for me. I'm asking you to let me in. All of it. The truth. The danger. The darkness. Because I'd rather be in the dark with you than in the light without you. For a long moment, Silas was utterly still, as if her words were a spell he was afraid to break. Then, the control he held over himself, the fortress he had built around his heart, crumbled. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. It was a kiss different from all the others. It was not a question or a restrained promise. It was a surrender, a sealing of a pact. It was full of the passion he had always held back, a raw, desperate, and grateful love that spoke of a future where there were no more secrets, where the light and the dark would finally meet and merge. He held her face in his hands, his forehead resting against hers. "It's yours," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My world, my life, my heart. It's all yours, Cassandra. Always." And as they stood there, wrapped in each other and the falling night, the story of the scared woman and the lonely king found its true beginning, not in a lie but in a choice, made with open eyes and a courageous heart. Did Cassie and Silas's journey capture your heart? If you were swept away by this story of a love that conquered fear and secrets, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Our channel is filled with tales of dangerous passion, hidden identities, and romance that defies all odds. Subscribe now and join us for the next unforgettable story. Your next obsession is just a click away.